Hi guys. Now today we're going to focus on the second of our Adrian Rich poetry. So the second poem is Living in Sin. So if you just make sure that you have this particular sheet that I sent you, it's the handwritten one with the 6 points, the 6 aspects of style written out, and I'm going to relate those back then to the theme of the poem and as I'm reading through it. Okay, so Living in Sin, then, if we look at the title itself, obviously it relates back to a particular idiom or phrase that was used to represent a very disapproving attitude towards couples who were unmarried and yet living together. Okay, so the poem was published in 1955, and Adrian Rich is just looking here at the reality of romantic relationships. So there's a simple contrast that is apparent from the very beginning, the ideal versus the real. We have two central characters here, a woman and a man, so simply referred to as she and he. They're never named, so it makes it more universal, more relatable, that terrible word. And it sort of emphasizes then the idea that she had certain expectations about living together. She had a fantasy or a dream that everything would be perfect. She was very naive and she was very idealistic. Now, in the poem, in the cold light of day, we can see that she is becoming a little bit more cynical, that she's quite disillusioned and disenchanted with her life and her life choices. So the poem then explores the reality of romantic relationships. It explores, of course, gender roles. Remember, we had that when we were looking at comparative studies, so sort of conventional gender roles versus, we say, modern gender roles, or very traditional gender roles, of course, assigned to men and women, and then how men and women try to break free of that or try to blur the lines, essentially, then the kind of demarcations between what a man ought to do and what a woman ought to do. Okay, so Living in Sin then gives you the idea of the background or context of the poem itself. So focusing then, of course, on this particular relationship between these sort of anonymous characters as such. So the form of the poem, it isn't a sonnet or a ballad or an ode. It is what we call an aubade. That's Aubade. So I've mentioned that at the very beginning in point number 1 here, that an aubade is a poem or indeed a song that is appropriate to the dawn or early morning. So the setting then, of course, reinforces that. Okay, so we have an early morning scenario here with a woman in the studio apartment, the flat itself, and she's contemplating her life and contemplating the nature of her relationship. Now, if we think about a studio apartment, first of all, it can simply mean an open plan apartment or flat, okay, where there are no walls or rooms essentially. Okay, so it's like different areas then, the kitchen, dining area, sitting room area, or sitting area essentially, and then obviously just a bed. So it's open plan. It kind of suggests the idea of, we'd say, a young couple who've just moved in together and are in a way then rebelling against societal norms, rebelling against society's expectations that they get married first and then they move into their first home. Okay, now an aubade, as I've said then, obviously is associated with the morning or the dawn. Okay, so if we think about the word dawn, it does suggest, of course, the idea of a new beginning, but it also suggests the idea of a dawning, a realization, or a revelation. So we do have an epiphany in this particular poem, where the woman realizes, of course, that her life is not as perfect as she assumed it was going to be. So she had certain expectations about the relationship, which are now being dashed. So we have that age-old theme then, the reality versus, of course, her romantic expectations. So the ideal versus the real. Okay, we notice point number 2, the language is restrained or reined in by the poet. So it's quite measured, essentially, then. Okay, it's not very emotional or heartfelt. A lot of it is very sort of matter of fact, very straightforward. And the language, of course, reflects then, I would say, the idea that she's keeping her emotions sort of closed off, very close to her chest. She's not kind of revealing it to her partner or her boyfriend. Number 3, free verse is employed by Rich. So free verse, if you just want to make a note, just simply means that it is unrhymed and unmetered. So we don't have a definite rhyming scheme or pattern like we did in Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, for example. Okay, think about that was very regimented. That was quite conventional in terms of the structure. We don't have a definite meter. We had, of course, when we looked at Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. So it's a kind of a looser and freer poem then as such. It's a much more modern poem. And we can see then the evolution of Adrienne Rich's style in this particular poem then as well, because she's moving away from that more regimented and sort of measured and controlled style into a looser and freer and more natural, maybe organic style when we're looking at Living in Sin. And remember that she was trying to move away from her father's control then as well. Her father's more kind of dictating to her how she ought to write, how she should express herself. So it's really about the idea of this particular woman then, not Rich herself, because Rich didn't live in sin as such. She moved in with Alfred Conrad after they had married and they had 3 sons together. But it's just sort of emphasizing the idea that she's trying to universalize this particular experience then, okay? Because the notion is that as revealed in the second half of the poem, that her boyfriend or partner is an artist. So he's very kind of avant-garde and kind of radical. And there's a kind of a sense of daring and adventure. Then they're moving in together, even though society, of course, frowns upon the nature of their relationship and their circumstances. So in a way, she was defying society, and now she feels almost guilty, essentially, then for questioning the relationship, or for feeling irritated and frustrated and even bored, essentially. Okay, so if you think about it, we're looking at the fact that it's an obeyed, we're looking at the restrained language, and we're looking at the use of free verse then. That's the third point. Number 4 then, loose punctuation is used throughout. The lines are less rigid and formal than conventional poetry. Okay, so that gives us a very kind of natural feel. And remember, we're just focusing on the thoughts, the musings of this particular woman in the poem. So it's not like she's kind of sitting down and writing out a list, okay, or even writing a paragraph essentially here. We just have these kind of simple thoughts that are flowing one into the next, a kind of a stream of consciousness style for a lot of the poem as well. And that means that a lot of what we read is open to interpretation. I mean, it's a poem, so obviously it's open to interpretation, but there's sort of 2 or 3 different ideas for each particular image or symbol that we notice as well. Okay, so she had thought the studio would keep itself. So she didn't realize, of course, once more it's emphasizing how naive she was when she first moved in. She didn't realize that she would have to do some upkeep, housework, essentially maintenance on the apartment itself. But she assumed, of course, that this relationship would be sort of essentially very exciting and very passionate and very romantic. No dust upon the furniture of love. So the furniture of love, of course, would be the relationship itself, the loving relationship itself. And she didn't realize, of course, that a relationship needs to be maintained or nurtured, to be looked after, to be taken care of, essentially. That a relationship just doesn't come fully formed and then it remains exactly like that for the rest of her life. So it's really emphasizing once more how naive she was then when she first moved in or when she first fell in love. Also, dust becomes very literal in the poem as well, and this relates back to the idea of gender roles, that she didn't realise, of course, that the upkeep of the studio apartment would be left to her, that she would have to do more or less everything in terms of the cooking and the cleaning and the basic housework. Half heresy to wish the taps less vocal, the pains relieved of grime. So if you think of heresy here, of course, that would suggest we'd say rejecting something that is sacred, or violating something that is sacred, or rejecting something profane, something we'd say that is divine. So going against religious belief or going against God would be considered heresy. So in a way then, this relates back to how guilty she feels because she is now nitpicking, of course, at the relationship itself. She's now thinking about all the faults and the flaws within the relationship. And she feels guilty because she had bought into this particular fantasy of love being a kind of panacea that would solve all her problems and that life would be perfect from then on in. So half heresy to wish the taps less vocal. So think about it, these are very ordinary kind of mundane or humdrum images, quite dull images really of the tap, the leaking tap. Think of a dripping tap. And think of the idea, of course, it represents that the tap maybe is flawed or cracked and it needs to be repaired. And this is the idea of the relationship then as well. It's not as perfect as she first thought it to be. Or it's the notion perhaps that if she neglects the leaking tap, then maybe, of course, it will eventually be broken. So it's the idea that she needs to look after the relationship. Otherwise, of course, it will crumble to nothing. It also suggests on a very basic level here that wishing the tap's less vocal, it's how irritating a dripping tap is. If you have a quiet room or a quiet apartment and you can hear every little drip, every little sound made by the tap, and you feel as if you're going mad. So half heresy to wish the tap's less vocal, the panes relieved of grime. So the panes would just be the window panes then, of course, relieved of grime, but the idea then, of course, that she wishes that the windows essentially were pristine and clear and perfect. If you think about it, that is a metaphor or a symbol then as well, isn't it? Because it reinforces the idea then of having a clearer outlook. And the windows are dirty or grubby or smeared, of course. And it's kind of emphasizing, perhaps we'd say, just the sheer dullness of having to clean the windows or having to maintain the apartment or do the housework as such there too. But even think of how she's using the verb there, relieved of grime. There is a sense of frustration, of course, that she realizes that she has to maintain all of this, that she has to perform all of these tasks as such then, chores. A plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl. Now, if you think about this particular image, might be a literal image that is arranged on a table, okay? Because we learn halfway through the poem that her beloved, that her boyfriend actually is an artist. Or this could represent then the idea that she had before she moved into the apartment as to what it would look like. Okay, so she imagines then, of course, all the accoutrements of a perfect apartment, that everything looks very appealing and very attractive here. If you think of a plate of pears, of course, succulent, juicy fruit. It's like having a bowl of apples, so everything is very fresh and perfect. But also pears, of course, going back throughout literature and even art and so on as well, usually represent sensuality or sexuality. I mean, Shakespeare used the image of the pair in Romeo and Juliet, then, of course, to emphasize a very erotic image. So a piano with a Persian shawl. If you think of piano, of course, associated with music and harmony, obviously a perfect relationship. And we also think of the idea of the piano being associated, of course, with love songs or beautiful music or being serenaded. The Persian shawl, then, of course, is something that is very lavish, very rich, perhaps brightly coloured, a soft, sensuous silk or fabric then as well. So it's emphasizing these particular images of sweet perfection, and then the reality of her relationship, of course, is literally a dripping tap and a grubby window. So this could be the still life that her artist boyfriend has arranged then on the table, or it could just be the idea that she is imagining, of course, or what she did imagine the apartment to look like and what that represents in terms of harmony and perfection and beauty. A cat stalking the picturesque, amusing mouse had risen at his urging. So if you think about it, this is just simply a picture of a cat and a mouse, but even the cat and the mouse essentially is depicted as very attractive or appealing here. If you think about picturesque means very pretty, and then amusing would mean kind of charming, endearing as such, you know. So even the vermin in the picture is perfect, but of course the vermin in real life is not. But also notice how she is using the verb stalking then to describe the cat, who is the predator, and then the mouse, who is the prey, is just simply amusing here. So that could suggest the idea of the nature of the relationship then between the she and the he. The notion, of course, that he pursued her at the very beginning of the relationship or the early stage of the relationship, And now, of course, they just take each other for granted, as we'll see later on when we look at his behaviour then in the second half of the poem. Not that at each separate stair would writhe under the milkman's tramp. The morning light so coldly will delineate the scraps of last night's cheese and 3 sepulchral bottles. So here she's looking at the reality then of the debris that's kind of strewn around the apartment. So kind of the morning after the night before. So she's emphasising the idea then of the appearance of the milkman, very kind of old-fashioned image, but the idea, of course, that a bottle of milk or a couple of bottles of milk would be delivered then to every single household by the milkman early in the morning. But think about it though, it's not a kind of a cheerful image that she's using here. Think about it, these are images of kind of pain and suffering. Each separate stair would writhe under the milkman's tramp. So it's not like a jaunty stroll down the street, essentially. He's kind of stomping or pounding on each particular step, and it's almost as if the entire apartment is kind of juddering then to the sound. So she's woken up by this particular image, then she's woken up by the milkman treading very heavily on each particular stair then, 5 o'clock in the morning. And it kind of emphasizes just that sense of being irritated, of course, that you can't even enjoy a morning's rest. And especially when you think, of course, that they were eating and drinking, it's suggested, until the early hours the night before. So the milkman's tramp then, that morning light so coldly would delineate. Now cold would suggest, of course, obviously the morning after the night before, where everything is just so specific and everything is very clear when you observe it. And the idea perhaps that she's being quite cynical now when she looks around the apartment and she's disgusted, of course, by what she sees. So it would delineate, which simply means to outline, to show the scraps of last night's cheese. So the delicious cheese is now sort of dry and kind of dog-eared and rubbery, perhaps we'd say, not very appetizing or appealing. And 3 sepulchral bottles. This is kind of an interesting description here, because the bottles would suggest, perhaps we'd say, bottles of wine. And we kind of think 3 of them for 2 of them. Why were they drinking so much? Are they drinking just to recreate that kind of romantic feeling, or to rekindle the spark? Or are they drinking, of course, just to forget their lives, perhaps their lives that are not as interesting or intriguing as they first thought? And sepulchred is a great adjective to use there, because a sepulchre, of course, is a tomb. So it kind of suggests the idea of a funeral and a burial here as well. Is this suggesting, of course, that the relationship will not last? Does it suggest, of course, the death of love, of eroticism, perhaps, as well? Then she goes on, of course, to consider, on the kitchen shelf among the saucers, a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own. So she has an infestation of at least one, of maybe a whole coterie of insects here. And she feels as if they're watching her, kind of staring at her. And notice how she anthropomorphizes the beetle here. So we first of all just have a pair of beetle eyes, that's fair enough. But he's depicted as an envoy from some village in the mouldings. Village would suggest, of course, obviously, a number of insects here. And an envoy is just literally a messenger as well. So it's almost like the beetle is conveying silently a particular message to her, perhaps an accusatory one. The idea, of course, that the kitchen is not as clean as it ought to be. Or so the idea perhaps reminding her then of the reality of her life now, and how humdrum and ordinary and drab and perhaps dreary it has become. Or just reinforcing, of course, those kind of traditional gender roles, that the housework is now her duty or her responsibility, and it has nothing to do with her artistic or artist boyfriend. So we have the 3 sepulchre bottles, that on the kitchen shelf among the saucers, a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own, envoy from some village in the mouldings. Mouldings would just mean, of course, the plaster. Sometimes it means sort of like strips of wood, but if you think of like a skirting board or the plaster that you find in crevices, corners of the room, and all the little nooks and crannies, little crevices, where all the little insects can scurry in and out, essentially there. That's really what that means there. Meanwhile, now we're moving on to he, as mentioned here, the anonymous sort of boyfriend, the second character, with a yawn. So it's the idea perhaps, has he just woken up? Has she been awake for a while and just considering? Because it does suggest, of course, that she's woken by the milkman, but it has no effect on him. He's there just lying there snoring away. So he awakes with a yawn, sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard. So he just sounds out a few notes on the piano then, which suggests, of course, that obviously the piano is real. Or is this just, we'd say, electronic keyboard, something cheap, as opposed to the idea of a beautiful grand piano, which she had in mind before they moved in? Is this just showing the contrast between the ideal and the real again? So he just kind of sounds out a dozen notes and then declares it out of tune. So that would suggest the idea of a lack of harmony, or a lack of compatibility, perhaps we'd say, between the two as well. So the symbolism is very rich and very strong there. Shrugged at the mirror, rubbed at his beard, went out for cigarettes. So think about it. He doesn't shower, he doesn't clean his face, he's not clean shaven. You would expect that back in the 1950s. It's kind of the idea that he's very avant-garde, he's an artist, of course, a radical as such, but he seems kind of unkempt and untidy and sort of dishevelled, and he's not really concerned about his appearance or personal grooming here. Maybe it's the idea that he's taking the situation for granted, he's taking her for granted, he's taking the relationship for granted. There's no mention that he asks her what she wants from the shop. He just simply goes out to get cigarettes. There's no communication, there's no sense of warmth or intimacy between the two here. So it just emphasised the idea of a kind of routine, or the kind of humdrum details of the rather drab lives now at this particular stage. While she, jeered by the minor demons, of course, could be sort of the voices in her head ridiculing, mocking her. The minor demons, of course, could be perhaps, we'd say, people within society then reminding her, oh, you've made your bed, now you have to lie on it. So those disapproving voices, essentially, could be the minor demons. Or it could just kind of relate back to the idea of the half heresy as well. The notion, of course, then that she feels guilty because she's not as happy as she assumed she would have been. Or she assumed, of course, that she would live a very sort of carefree, romantic, passionate life or lifestyle. So we have her then returning to the chores here, pulled back the sheets and made the bed, and found a towel to dust the tablecloth. Well, the image of finding a towel, of course, would suggest that she doesn't have a proper duster. Has she ever done the dusting before? Now she's kind of resigned to it, that she has to do it. It's got to such a state that she has to clear up. Also the idea, of course, that he's left. So she's the only one behind, so she has to do the housework. She has to tidy up, of course, what is left behind after the night before. The bottles, the cheese, and so on here. Notice how she's making the bed as well. So once more, the kind of the dullness and the dreariness of that particular image. And then, of course, the contrast between that and the idea of the bed representing passion and romance for them. So pull back the sheets and made the bed and found a towel to dust the tabletop. And that reminds us, of course, of earlier in the poem, no dust upon the furniture of love. But this is the sad reality, of course, that housework has to be done, has to be maintained, has to be continued as such then. Okay, notice the language here again. Notice the run-on lines. That's kind of stream of consciousness style. There's a lack of control. It's not very regimented. Just sort of different ideas and symbols then woven together into this particular poem. And let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. That might suggest, of course, that she is not the best housekeeper. Or little housewife, essentially, then, that she neglects one particular duty is to make the coffee then for both of them, or maybe even just for him first thing in the morning. But if you think about the coffee pot, of course, just represents then routine, doesn't it? Morning routine. It's very typical. It represents a kind of humdrum aspect of their life, very mundane, quite banal again. But also then think about let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. Would this suggest the idea then of her inner feelings? Sort of boiling over, the sense of tension and frustration, a sense maybe of anger or resentment or bitterness as such, and the coffee represents that, but she doesn't verbalize it herself. By evening, she was back in love again, so we have a time lapse then. Okay, what has she done with her day? Is her artist boyfriend then just busying himself painting? What does she do with her day? Does she just simply lounge around? Does she spend her day cooking and cleaning? So by evening she was back in love again. So this is the idea then, of course, it's a more romantic atmosphere at night. Think kind of dim lighting, of course. They're snuggling up on the couch. Are they back to drinking wine again? Though not so holy. And that would suggest, of course, that maybe the shine has gone from the relationship. Maybe we'd say she is not as completely devoted to him as she was. Or maybe she's not as fully invested in the relationship or invested in the idea of the relationship as well. But throughout the night she woke sometimes. So she's not even awoken by the milkman this particular time, but she wakes up in anticipation, of course, of being woken up. So throughout the night she woke sometimes to feel the daylight coming, like a relentless milkman up the stairs. So notice the use of a simile towards the end. And think of the milkman, of course, is quite a benign character, sort of faceless and sort of anonymous, really, as such. He's not supposed to be a major character. He's just supposed to be a kind of peripheral character. Here he becomes more sinister, though. He's like a character in a horror film, essentially. And we get the idea then the daylight coming like a relentless milkman, relentless ongoing, so sort of like day after day, morning after morning, then she comes to this cold realization that her relationship is unfulfilling and unrewarding, that she becomes more and more frustrated and irritated with her life. So the daylight relates back to the idea then of the epiphany that I mentioned at the very beginning. And it also relates back then to the idea of the Obeid, which is our first point then on that particular sheet. Okay, so point number 5 then would be the strong symbols are used to represent the harsh reality of domesticity. Okay, so it's not very cozy here as such. It just becomes rather bland and uninteresting. So if we think about it, the bottle then, think of the empty bottle, okay, representing then, of course, the lack of adventure or excitement or passion within her life, and the contrast between the evening and night and then the morning, of course, afterwards. If we think the idea, of course, of the Beatles then, that would represent, perhaps we'd say, the kind of grottiness of the apartment itself. And then how that comes to represent then the opposite of what she was anticipating. Or the coffee pot, does that represent then routine, or does it represent, we'd say, herself and the idea of kind of these bubbling emotions that will soon boil over then. And then finally, number 6, the ironic title is used to emphasize the difference between the ideal and the real. Okay, so if we think about it, 3 sort of basic themes then: the reality of romantic relationships, okay, gender roles, and you can relate that back very simply then to housework itself, and then the ideal versus the real, which is a kind of a grander, more epic, sort of lofty theme, which has been explored, of course, by many poets throughout history. So that's your basic overview then of living in sin. So what you do is then you focus on 2 or 3 of the aspects of style that I've given you on the sheet there. Okay, so make sure, of course, that you go back and you have a look at the paragraphs on theme that I've given you for living in sin as well. And the next day then we'll move on to our 3rd poem. I'm hoping to have that organised by the end of this particular week. Okay, so Thursday perhaps I'll do that. If I have time, I'll do the last one on Friday, which means then we can move on to Eleni Quillanon next week. But it just depends. And I'll be organising then a class where you can ask questions and so on as well. Okay, so talk to you soon, guys. Take care.